This is Climate Watch. I'm Zhao Ying. Welcome to the show.
Electricity demand is surging around the world. More frequent heat waves are driving greater use of air conditioning, while the electrification of transportation, industry, data centers, and artificial intelligence is pushing demand even higher. The International Energy Agency says we are entering a new age of electricity, with global demand growing at its fastest rate in decades. We are already seeing that pressure in China. Just days after setting a historic high, the country's national peak power load hit another record on July 14th, reaching a massive 1,551 gigawatts. The rising demand is only part of the story. As more renewable energy enters the system, a new challenge is becoming increasingly important. How to keep the lights on when a growing share of electricity comes from sources that depend on the weather? To explore that question, our reporter Zhu Tianlu is joining us in the studio. She recently traveled to Changzhou, an industrial city in eastern China that has become a testing ground for a new generation of energy infrastructure. Tianlu, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Why is Changzhou such a revealing place to understand China's energy transition?
One reason Changzhou is so interesting is that it's not necessarily the first city people think of when they talk about energy. If someone asked me before the trip where I would go to report on renewable energy, I probably would have said somewhere in Western China, where many of the country's largest solar and wind projects are located. But Changzhou tells a very different story. It's an industrial city. It's a manufacturing city. And perhaps most importantly, it's a city with very high electricity demand, but relatively limited local energy resources. And in fact, that's one of the reasons we chose Changzhou for an episode of our 4-part podcast series on China's green transition. The episode was called Powering the Transition, Rewiring an Industrial City. We were not simply interested in where clean electricity is generated. We wanted to understand what happens after that electricity enters the system and how an industrial city keeps the lights on while bringing more renewables into the mix. And when I spoke with Shen Li from the city's Development and Reform Commission, she explained that this combination of high demand and limited resource endowment was exactly what pushed Changzhou to explore new energy solutions. And that struck me because it reflects a challenge facing many places around the world. Economic growth requires energy, manufacturing requires energy, modern life requires energy, but at the same time, countries are trying to reduce emissions and meet climate targets. So the question becomes, how do you make those objectives compatible? And I think Changzhou is trying to answer that question in real time. What makes it especially interesting is that the city isn't relying on one single technology. Instead, it's building an ecosystem. Because during the trip, I visited industrial parks powered by microgrids, residential communities with rooftop solar, compressed air energy storage facilities built in underground salt caverns, and virtual power plant control centers and traditional coal plants that are adapting to a changing energy landscape. And all of those pieces exist within the same city, and that's quite unusual from a reporting perspective. Because often when journalists cover energy, we visit one project, a solar farm or wind farm or a battery facility. But in Changzhou, I felt like I was seeing multiple parts of the energy transition at once. And another reason I think the city is revealing is because it highlights the complexity of the transition. Sometimes public discussions frame energy transition as a relatively straightforward process. Renewables replace fossil fuels and emissions decline. The reality is much messier. There are technical constraints. economic constraints, grid constraints, storage constraints, and policy challenges. But I think Changzhou doesn't hide those complexities. And in fact, that's what makes it such a useful case study, I think. It's not presenting a perfect picture. It's showing what happens when a city tries to solve real-world energy problems under real-world conditions. And as a journalist, I think that's often where the most interesting stories are found.
Was there a moment during your reporting when the complexity of the energy transition suddenly became real to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, it wasn't during a formal interview. It was more of a gradual realization that eventually clicked. When I started the trip, I approached each visit as a separate story. One day I was looking at solar generation. Another day I was visiting a storage project. Then I was talking about virtual power plants, and then about coal power upgrades. At first, these felt like independent topics, but there was a moment when I began to see how interconnected everything actually was. I remember visiting the virtual power plant management center in Changzhou. Inside the control room, there was a large digital screen displaying energy data from across the city in real time. Solar facilities, storage systems, charging stations, industrial loads, all connected through one platform. And as Fang Yan, who is the head of the Virtual Power Plant Management Center, she explained how the system worked. I suddenly realized that what I had been seeing throughout the trip was not separate projects at all. They were different components of the same system. That was a moment the complexity became real, because every new solution seemed to create another challenge. Solar power helps reduce emissions, but solar generation fluctuates, so you need storage. And storage helps balance fluctuations. But then you need digital platforms to coordinate storage resources. As more distributed resources appear, you need virtual power plants. As renewable penetration rises, you need technologies like grid-forming storage to maintain stability. And throughout all of this, conventional power sources still play an important supporting role. And what struck me was that energy transition isn't a single technology story. It was a story about managing interactions between technologies. And I think that is much harder. And honestly speaking, that's something I don't think I fully appreciated before the trip. The public often sees the visible parts of energy transition, the solar panels, the wind turbines, the electric vehicles, but much of the real work is happening behind the scenes. It's happening in control rooms, in software systems, in grid operations, and those parts are often less visible but equally important, and that visit changed how I think about energy infrastructure.
Yes, indeed. And one of your most striking field visits was the Salt Cavern Energy Storage Project. What stayed with you from that experience?
Without question, I think the strongest memory is the contrast between what I could see and what was actually happening underground. When we arrived at the Jingtan Salt Cavern Compressed Air Energy Storage Project, what I saw above ground was a collection of industrial facilities, large white pipes, tanks, and equipment spread across the site. It looked impressive, but not radically different from other industrial projects I've visited as a reporter. Then technician Chen Ying started explaining what was happening beneath our feet. He told me that the system uses underground salt caverns to store compressed air generated using surplus electricity. And suddenly I realized that the most important part of the project was invisible. More than 1,000 meters underground, there was effectively a giant energy reservoir. And standing there, I found that fascinating, because when most people think about energy storage, they immediately think about batteries. And this project challenges that assumption. Chen described it as a giant green power bank. When renewable generation is abundant, electricity is used to compress air and store it underground. And when electricity is needed, that compressed air is released and used to generate power. And what impressed me the most was the scale. One thing I heard repeatedly during the trip was that storage is becoming increasingly important as renewable energy expands. But storage itself is not one technology. There are different solutions for different needs. Batteries are extremely important, but projects like this show that engineers are also exploring long-duration storage options that can operate at much larger scales. And more broadly speaking, that visit captured something I saw throughout Changzhou. The energy transition is not only producing new technologies, it's also forcing people to rethink old infrastructure and natural resources. So in this case, a salt cavern became part of a modern energy system. And I think that's a powerful example of how innovation often works, not necessarily by creating something entirely new, but by finding new ways to use what already exists. And that visit stayed with me because it made the transition feel tangible, physical, and surprisingly creative.
Yeah, but was there one challenge that almost everyone you interviewed kept coming back to?
Yeah, no matter who I interviewed, whether they worked in solar power, energy storage, grid operations, sooner or later, the conversation would come back to the same issue, intermittency. At first, I found that surprising because these people worked in very different fields. But after a while, I realized that they were all talking about the same fundamental challenge from different perspectives. One person who explained this particularly clearly was Yang Bao from China Solar. He pointed out that renewable energy has many advantages. Solar power is relatively quick to deploy, highly scalable and increasingly cost competitive. But unlike traditional power plants, solar and wind generation depend on natural conditions. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, and perhaps most importantly, electricity demand doesn't necessarily follow the same pattern as renewable generation. A city may need electricity at 8 p.m. when people return home, turn on lights, and switch on air conditioners, but solar generation may already be declining. And that mismatch is where the challenge begins. One thing I realized during the trip is that electricity is different from many other commodities. Electricity is much harder. Supply and demand have to be balanced almost very well. So even though renewable energy is expanding rapidly, engineers are constantly asking a practical question: what happens when generation and demand do not match? And that's why intermittency kept appearing in almost every conversation. And what I found fascinating is that every solution I saw in Changzhou was in one way or another designed to address this challenge. Storage addresses intermittency and microgrids address it, and virtual power plants address intermittency. So in other words, the transition isn't simply about building more renewables. It's about building a system that can manage variability. And that would be probably one of the biggest lessons I learned. The more renewable energy you add, the more important flexibility becomes. And that's why almost every engineer eventually returned to the same topic, not because they were repeating a talking point, but I think it's because they were all confronting the same physical reality.
So if that is the challenge, how are people trying to solve it?
That's where the things got really interesting, because everywhere I went, people were talking about different solutions. Some talked about storage, and some talked about microgrids. And one technology that really caught my attention was something called grid-forming storage. And to be honest, this was probably one of the most technically challenging concepts I encountered during the trip. If someone talks about solar panels, most people immediately have a mental image. And if someone talks about batteries, we can understand the basic idea. But grid-forming storage is much more abstract. When I first heard the term, I honestly wasn't sure why it matters so much. Then I spoke with Wu Jiping from NR Electric, and that conversation completely changed my understanding. He explained that traditional power systems were designed around large generators, such as coal-fired power plants and hydropower stations. These generators contain large rotating machines. Because of their physical characteristics, they naturally provide what engineers call inertia. And inertia helps stabilize the grid when disturbances occur, and renewable energy behaves differently. Solar panels do not spin. So when many renewable energy systems connect to the grid through power electronics rather than large rotating machinery, as renewable penetration rises, the physical characteristics of the grid begin to change, and that creates new challenges. And what impressed me about Wu's explanation was that he was not presenting this as a purely Chinese problem. It is a challenge facing power systems around the world. As countries add more renewables, they have to think about how to maintain stability in a different type of electricity system. And Wu described grid forming as a technology that can mimic some of the stabilizing characteristics traditionally provided by conventional generators. So after the interview, I remember sitting down and thinking about what that actually meant. And the simplest way I could understand it was like this, like traditional storage follows the grid, and grid forming storage helps support and shape the grid itself. And that may sound like a subtle distinction, but it's actually very important, because the future challenge is not simply generating clean energy. It is maintaining a stable electricity system with much higher share of renewable energy. What fascinated me was that this issue is largely invisible to the public. Most people never think about the grid inertia, and most people only notice electricity when something goes wrong. But behind the scenes, engineers are solving extremely complex problems to ensure that doesn't happen.
Okay, so you're describing all these different technologies, and it sounds incredibly complicated. How do you get all these pieces work together?
One thing I realized during the trip was that solving the energy transition is not just about adding new technologies. It's also about how to coordinate them. And that became very clear when I visited the Virtual Power Plant Control Center in Changzhou. For me, it was probably one of the most revealing stops of the entire trip. When we entered the control room, the first thing I noticed was a giant screen displaying real-time energy data from across the city. There were solar installations, battery storage facilities, charging stations, industrial users, and various distributed energy resources. And everything was connected through one digital platform. And Fang Yan, who heads the center, explained how the system works. And what was very impressive is that the virtual power plant does not actually generate electricity itself. Instead, it coordinates existing resources. That may sound simple, but it's actually a profound shift in how electricity systems operate. Historically, power systems were relatively centralized. Electricity was generated at large power plants and delivered to consumers. Today, the picture is becoming more complicated. Consumers can also become producers. Buildings can generate electricity, and electric vehicles can store electricity. And industrial facilities can adjust the consumption, and storage systems can both consume and supply electricity. And suddenly, the grid becomes much more dynamic. And that is where virtual power plant comes in. They help coordinate all these distributed resources. And one thing I kept thinking during the visit was that Electricity systems are becoming increasingly digital. We are moving from a world where the main challenge was generating power to a world where information management is equally important. And this isn't unique to China. Around the globe, energy systems are becoming more decentralized and more complex. The more distributed resources you have, the more valuable coordination becomes. So when I looked at the virtual power plant, I was not just seeing a control room in Changzhou. I felt like I was seeing a glimpse of how future electricity systems may operate, not necessarily through one giant power plant, but through thousands of smaller resources working together through digital coordination.
Yeah, but I'm kind of wondering what this really means to the daily life of ordinary people. I mean, can they really feel or see these changes?
Actually, that became one of the questions I kept asking myself during the trip, because after spending days talking about energy storage, stability, and the virtual power plants, I wanted to know what all of this looks like from the perspective of the people who actually live and work in these places. And one answer came from Jinggu Garden community. I remember speaking with a 73-year-old resident named Pan Yueqing. As we walked around the neighborhood, she pointed out solar-powered facilities, rooftop solar installations, and upgraded drainage systems designed to better cope with extreme weather. And what struck me was that she was not talking about climate targets or energy policy. She was talking about changes she could see in her everyday life. For her, it's like the transition was not an engineering story. It was about living in a community that felt cleaner, greener, and more resilient. And I think that's how people experience these changes, not through technical terminology, but through improvements in the places where they live. And I also saw another side of the story, because at Liyang Changzhou Industrial Park, Li Jie showed me how businesses are experiencing the transition. I was introduced to a microgrid system that combines solar power, battery storage, EV charging facilities, and thermal storage technologies. Now, a microgrid sounds like a very technical concept, but what it means in practice is fairly straightforward. It's a local energy system that can generate, store, and manage electricity close to where it is used. So for companies inside the park, that translates into something very tangible: lower energy costs, greater flexibility, and more reliable power supply. So people experience the transition in very different ways, depending on where they are. For residents like the granny, it's visible in the neighborhood around them. And for businesses, it is reflected in how they manage energy and control costs. And the technologies may be different, but the principle is similar. So the transition becomes real when people can see a practical benefit in their daily lives. And that's something I kept coming back to throughout the trip. Whether I was talking to engineers, policymakers, factory managers, or local residents, I think the most successful projects were usually the ones that connected big energy goals with everyday needs.
Yes. So if we put all these pieces together, what kind of energy system is China trying to build?
By the end of the trip, I found myself thinking less about individual technologies and more about architecture, because every project I visited seemed to represent one piece of a much larger system. At first glance, a salt cavern storage facility, a microgrid, and a virtual power plant might seem unrelated. But after spending time with engineers and policymakers, I realized they are all part of the same effort. They are trying to build an electricity system that is cleaner, more flexible, and more resilient. And the main grid acts as a backbone. Microgrids function like capillaries, and virtual power plants serve as the brain. Storage systems help regulate energy flows, and each component performs a different function, but none can operate effectively in isolation. So what makes this transition particularly challenging is that multiple objectives have to be achieved simultaneously. And the system must reduce emissions, it must remain affordable, and it must stay reliable. So achieving any one of those goals is difficult. Achieving all three at the same time is even harder. That's why I think the energy transition is not really a technology story. It's a system story. It's about how technologies interact, how markets operate, how information flows, and how infrastructure evolves. And that's ultimately what Changzhou revealed to me. It's not a city installing renewable energy, but a city experimenting with a new model for managing energy altogether.
Yeah, but how would you interpret the relationship between renewables and coal in China's current energy system?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think this is probably one of the most debated aspects of China's energy transition. Before going to Changzhou, I tended to see coal and renewables as competing with each other. Like many people, I assumed the story was fairly straightforward as renewable energy grows and coal gradually declines. But what I encountered during the trip was a much more complicated reality. When I visited China Energy Changzhou power plant, I spoke with Xu Wei, who is the plant's deputy general manager, and what struck me was that he was not talking about competing with renewable energy. He talked about adapting to a power system that is changing very quickly. He explained that coal plants today are increasingly being asked to operate differently from the way they did in the past. Traditionally, coal plants were designed to run steadily and continuously, and they provided what people often call base load power. And the goal was stability and predictability. But as more solar and wind power come online, coal plants are increasingly being asked to become more flexible. So when renewable generation is strong, they may need to reduce output. And when renewable generation falls, they may need to respond quickly and help balance the system. And honestly, that was not something I had spent much time thinking about before this trip. Most public discussions focus on how much renewable energy is being added. We hear about new solar farms, new wind projects, and record-breaking installation figures. And what gets discussed much less is what happens to the rest of the system as renewable capacity continues to grow. One thing I kept hearing throughout the Changzhou trip was that the transition is not only about building more renewables, it's more about managing a much more complex electricity system. That's why people were talking about storage, virtual power plant. They were talking about grid forming technologies, and that's also why they were talking about the changing role of coal power. But of course, this doesn't eliminate the debate. Many people would argue that coal use ultimately needs to decline further if climate goals are to be achieved, and that's a legitimate discussion, and it's an important one. But what I observed in Changzhou was that many engineers were focused on a more immediate challenge. How do you maintain reliability while building a cleaner energy system? How do you keep factories running, homes powered, and hospitals operating while the structure of the electricity system is changing? So the way I came to think about it is like this. Renewable energy is clearly becoming a larger part of China's power mix, and that trend is likely to continue. But at the current stage of the transition, coal is still playing an important role, not only as a source of electricity, but increasingly as a source of flexibility and system support. So in other words, the role of coal is changing, and that was probably one of the biggest lessons I took away from Changzhou. The transition is not simply about replacing one technology with another one. It's about redesigning an entire energy system while keeping it functioning every single day. So that's a much more complicated challenge than it sometimes appears from the outside.
Yes, indeed. But what do you think people outside China often misunderstand about this transition?
I think one common misunderstanding is that people tend to view China's energy transition through a single lens. Some people focus only on the scale of renewable deployment and conclude that everything is progressing rapidly and smoothly, and others focus only on the continued presence of coal and conclude that nothing is really changing. But what I saw in Changzhou did not fit either of those narratives. The reality was far more complicated. As I said, for example, I visited advanced energy storage projects and virtual power plants and industrial microgrids that would have seemed futuristic just a few years ago. At the same time, I also visited a coal-fired power plant that continues to play an important role in maintaining system stability and reliability. Both realities exist simultaneously. And another misconception is that people sometimes imagine the transition as a purely environmental project. Of course, climate goals are important, but many of the people I interviewed were focused on issues such as energy security, industrial competitiveness, and grid stability. And these concerns are not unique to China. They are concerns that countries around the globe are grappling with. I also think people sometimes underestimate how difficult the transition actually is. It is relatively easy to announce targets. But I think it's much harder to redesign infrastructure that supports hundreds of millions of people and one of the world's largest industrial economies. So what impressed me the most during the trip was not that everyone had all the answers. It was that many people were openly discussing the challenges. Like storage remains expensive somehow, grid integration remains difficult, and market mechanisms continue to evolve, and there are still many unresolved questions. So to me, it is actually a sign of a serious conversation, because major transitions are rarely straightforward. They are usually messy and imperfect, and they are usually full of trade-offs. What I saw in Changzhou was not a finished model. It was a work in progress, and perhaps that's the most accurate way to understand China's energy transition as a whole, I think.
Okay. Well, after all your interviews, are there still any unanswered questions?
Because in some ways, every person I interviewed was helping answer one set of questions while simultaneously raising another. If I had to identify the biggest unanswered question, it would be, how do we build an electricity system that is not only cleaner, but also economically sustainable over the long term? Because during the trip, I saw remarkable innovation, advanced storage technologies, digital platforms, and I also saw engineers solving problems that many people outside the industry never even think about. But all of those solutions come with costs. Someone has to build the infrastructure, someone has to maintain it, and someone has to invest in it. And ultimately, those costs have to be managed in a way that remains affordable for society. Another question I kept coming back to concerns speed. The transition is happening quickly in some areas, but electricity systems are enormous and long-lived. So, like, power plants can operate for decades, transmission infrastructure lasts for decades, and industrial facilities are built around long investment cycles. So how quickly can systems actually change without creating new risks? I don't think anyone I interviewed claimed to have a definitive answer. And honestly, that made me trust their perspectives more, because the people working on these issues every day seem very aware of the uncertainties. I've often found that the most interesting stories are not about certainty, it's about tension, it's about competing priorities. So in Changzhou, I saw a lot of that, the tension between sustainability and affordability, and between innovation and reliability, and also the tension between long-term goals and short-term realities. Those tensions are not necessarily problems to be eliminated. They may simply be part of the transition itself. And I suspect many countries will be wrestling with similar questions in the years ahead.
Yeah, so when you look back at a trip, what moment or image stays with you the most?
I think the moment that stays with me the most is actually a conversation I had with Deng Wei, who is from China Storage. We were talking about climate change and energy transition, and at one point he started reflecting on his childhood in Anhui province. He told me that when he was growing up, heavy snowfall was a regular part of winter, and he remembered playing in the snow and experiencing winters that felt very different from today. Then he mentioned his daughter. He said she loves snow too, but those heavy snowfalls have become much less common, and he wondered whether future generations would experience the same winters that he remembered. It was a very simple observation. There were no technical terms, no policy discussions, no statistics, but it's just a father thinking about the world his daughter will inherit. And for some reason, that conversation stayed with me. Maybe because so much of the reporting trip involved highly technical subjects, but that conversation reminded me why these issues matter in the first place. At the end of the day, energy transition is not really about technology. Technology is the tool. The deeper question is what kind of future we want to build, what kind of environment we leave to future generations, and how we balance that goal with the very real need for economic development and reliable energy. What I appreciated about Deng's comment was that it captured the complexity of the transition without turning it into an argument. He was simply describing a personal experience, so sometimes those moments can be more powerful than any data or statistics. And when I think back on Changzhou's trip, that is probably what stays with me the most. It's not a machine, not a building, not a project, but a conversation that connected a very large global challenge to one family's everyday life. And I think that's ultimately what we are trying to express, what we are trying to report, connect big systems to human stories.
Okay, Tianlu, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that wraps up this edition of Climate Watch. You can find more episodes on your favorite podcast platforms. Just search for Climate Watch and hit subscribe. Don't forget to leave us a quick review or share it with a friend. You can also email us at radio@cgtn.com with your questions or feedback. And stay updated on the latest climate stories with our Substack newsletter, Climate Choices. I'm Zhao Ying. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.